This year's Eurovision Song Contest ended with one of the biggest splits that we've ever seen between how the national juries voted and how the public voted. Loreen from Sweden dominated the jury vote, and Karja from Finland got a landslide televote. As a result, the winner came down to who was going to do better with the other system. Karja ranked 4th with the juries, and Loreen ranked 2nd with the public, giving the victory to Sweden. Since she won Eurovision, despite the fact that Finland had a huge lead with the televote, we've again seen this debate arise around the juries and the role that they play in the outcome of the show. Some people say they want their influence to be reduced, other people want them gone completely, and the emotion behind all of this has led certain people to come up with some pretty ridiculous theories that suggest this wasn't a legitimate win. So since there's been a lot of hysteria around this, let's take a look at how the split system actually operates, what exactly happened this year, and whether or not it needs fixing. Since the introduction of the jury televote split in 2009, there have been 14 contests. In 6 of those contests, the winners were the mutual favorites of the public and the national juries. Alexander Rybak from Norway, Lena from Germany, Loreen from Sweden on her first win, Emily de Forest from Denmark, Conchita Wurst from Austria, and Salvador Sobral from Portugal. 4 winners secured their victories by being the televote frontrunners despite not being the first choice of the juries. Elle and Nikki from Azerbaijan, who were 2nd, Netta from Israel, who was 3rd, Måneskin from Italy, who were 4th, and Kalush Orchestra from Ukraine, who were 4th as well. There have also been 2 winners who managed to get the highest point total and win the show without being the first choice of either side of the voting system. Jamala from Ukraine, who was 2nd with the juries and televote, and Duncan Lawrence from the Netherlands, who was 3rd with the juries and 2nd with the public. And so, how many times has the jury favorite been named the overall winner despite not coming first with the televote? Twice. Both times it was in favor of Sweden, in 2015 with Måns Zelmerlöw, and this year with Loreen's 2nd win. Now, that might look like it's more than a coincidence given that it was the same country who was able to win the show that way, but the reality is that in a split system this is always going to be a possibility, and because the split is nearly 50-50 on both sides, it makes it all the more possible. If the argument is that the juries have been working against the choice of the public, the televote favorites have actually won 10 out of 14 contests. And even with the 2 compromise winners, where neither song came first with the public or juries, they were still more favored by the televote when we look at the point totals. But it's also important to mention that the way that this unfolded on TV was very different the first time the jury favorite won. In 2015, the jury and televote scores were combined and averaged to give a single set of points from each country. There was only one voting sequence done in the traditional way of calling each of the spokespeople to deliver the points. So at the time, there was no way of knowing where the points came from during the broadcast. It was only revealed after that Sweden was the 3rd choice of the public, behind Russia in 2nd and Italy in 1st. The following year, in 2016, the votes were split into 2 separate rankings, and that was a mostly welcome decision because it allowed for more transparency and it added an extra layer of excitement. But it didn't account for the kind of result that we had this year, where that drastic split unfolded in front of our eyes in such an extreme way. The jury points are typically much more spread out, meaning that you don't usually see the points gathering at the top of the scoreboard. The favorite usually doesn't break the 300-point mark, and the odd time that it has, the songs below it landed in the 200s. The televote, on the other hand, often sees much bigger point totals towards the top of the scoreboard, and the favorites are frequently in the 300s. So how is it that Sweden got nearly twice as many jury points as Israel in 2nd and Italy in 3rd? Well, to better understand that, we'll need to take a look at the numbers and see exactly how each juror voted. These numbers represent the ranking assigned to Tattoo by each member of the national juries. 55 jurors thought Sweden delivered the complete package and put them first above all other songs. 31 jurors thought that Sweden was the 2nd best entry, and 26 thought that it was the 3rd best. If we put all of those together, there were 112 jurors that believed that Sweden deserved to finish on the podium, which is about 63%. Now, in order to get any points, your average rank between the 5 jurors needs to be in the top 10. So if we consider an individual juror's top 10 placement to be favorable, given that there are 25 to 26 options, you have 154 jurors who mostly preferred Tattoo over other songs. That leaves 24 who did not consider Sweden to be among the 10 best songs. 18 juries had at least one member in this category, and yet all those countries still gave Loreen points. Why? Well, I think there's at least two reasons for that, the main one being simply that those jurors were outnumbered by the others who gave Sweden a favorable score. For example, the lowest ranking came from Georgia's national jury. Here you can see that 2 members considered the song to be somewhere in the middle of the pack, whereas the other 3 had it in the top 7. And because there were more favorable rankings than not favorable, it was still enough to get the 7th highest average of all the songs, and therefore earn 4 points from Georgia. You can see similar disagreements with the juries from Belgium, Australia, Iceland, Switzerland, and San Marino. The other reason has to do with the change that was made in 2018 to how the jury scores are calculated. It used to be a straightforward average where you would combine all the individual rankings of each song, divide them by the number of jurors, and then order them from highest to lowest. But now they use what's called an exponential weight model, which gives more weight to higher rankings than lower ones. This was done to make sure that one juror's low placement wouldn't overrule the higher placement of everyone else, which, depending on how the ranking goes of all the other songs, could have resulted in something that was highly preferred getting no points. It was a tweak that was made by the EBU to resolve what they saw as a problem, but it didn't account for the opposite. And so because 154 jurors placed Sweden in their top 10, those rankings had a higher influence than that of the 24 jurors who placed Sweden in the middle. And if you think that's unfair, it actually helped out Finland a lot more. If we were to take all the individual juror rankings of each song and average them, this is what the top 10 would look like. Now you might be wondering where Finland is. Kärja had the 4th most points with the jury, so naturally you'd expect to see him in the top 10, right? Well, if we extend this to a top 11, that's where we find Finland, who's literally a decimal point behind Cyprus in 10th. If we take a look at how all the jurors ranked Finland, we see that there is a lot of favorability, just not quite as much as there was for Sweden. We see 14 first places, 18 second places, and 12 third places, meaning that a total of 44 jurors wanted to see Finland on the podium. As we did with Sweden, where we considered a top 10 placement to be favorable, a total of 91 jurors thought of Finland as being among the better acts of the night, which is more than half. What we also see is that there was a lot more disagreement within the individual juries. Among the most drastic splits is here with the Czech jury. Even though 2 jurors ranked Finland last and second last, the other 3's higher rankings still resulted in 5 points. Austria's jurors were also split, though not quite as much on the lower end, meaning that they still gave Finland 8 points. And it's the same story with Israel, Croatia, Serbia, Belgium, Azerbaijan, Cyprus, and Spain. This was the exact reason why the exponential weight model was introduced, because otherwise those higher rankings could have been completely negated by the lower ones, which would drag Finland's jury score down even more. But regardless of how the calculations were done, what critics tend to be more focused on with respect to Tattoo is, was it deserved? Did the song really warrant that many points? And how could that have happened without strings being pulled behind the scenes? Well, this isn't the only time that we've seen a runaway favorite in the jury score. Eu sei que não se ama sozinho. If we look at the individual rankings of Amar pelos dois, Portugal's winning song from 2017, we see that those jurors were even more won over by Salvador Sobral than this year's jurors were by Loreen. 79 jurors put Portugal first, 125 jurors put them in their top 3, 189 jurors put them in their top 10, which is even more than all the jurors that we had this year with 37 participating countries. On top of that, this was the last year before the exponential weight model was introduced. Had the scores been calculated like they are now, Portugal could have ended up with even more points, including from juries like Montenegro, who were one of the few that didn't give them any. Bulgaria, on the other hand, probably not so much. But speaking of Bulgaria, who came second that year, another thing that gets pointed out is the gap in between first and second place. And in using this example of 2017, it's true, we didn't see quite as much of a gap as we did this year. Now, frequently in these discussions, you see something that should be obvious but is easily overlooked. I don't mean to single this person out, but recently I got a comment on one of my videos about Eurovision this year, and this is what they had to say. If we really want to see how badly the juries have worked, we just need to consider the few points that they awarded to Spain and Portugal. The two songs were bound to be less popular among the public, but from a musical perspective, they were two masterpieces sung by extremely talented performers. By failing to recognize that, the juries have proven entirely inadequate right in their supposed area of expertise. Now, a lot of people can relate to this, whether it's about these songs specifically or about others. But this is the problem, looking at the number as some sort of representation of a song's individual quality. That's not what the score represents. It represents preference with respect to all of the songs in the show. It doesn't matter if the contest is made up of 26 of the best songs ever recorded or 26 of the worst. The amount of points given out doesn't change. And if among those songs, there's one that is mutually agreed to be that extra bit better than the rest and accumulates a lot of points, it can have the appearance of being amazing if people look at that number and think, oh, this song is worth that much. Now, with respect to the jurors, they have to consider all of the songs in comparison to one another and how they fit the criteria, which, as a reminder, are composition and originality of the song, quality of the performance on stage, vocal capacity of the performers, and overall impression of the act. There could have been jurors who felt like every song was poorly performed, badly written, and tasteless, and it wouldn't have mattered. They still have to put the songs in order, and that would have had the exact same effect on the score as someone else's ranking who thought every song was amazing and a masterpiece. What this represents is that Sweden was the only entry that was largely agreed to be the complete package. It doesn't mean that 178 people got together and said Sweden wins. The reason why the gap between first and second is so big is because there was very little agreement about who else was at that level. And if we look at the numbers, we see exactly how that played out. All of the songs this year had made it into a juror's top 3, and the majority of them had at least 10 to 15 jurors who ranked them that high. The ones closer to the bottom had less, but no less than 2. Similarly, all but 2 songs were someone's last place. The only exceptions were Italy and Sweden, who, as a result, had the highest averages. Even Germany, who had the least amount of top 10 placements, was still considered to be among the best entries in the eyes of 20 jurors. Sweden's result this year is outside the norm, but it's not the most extreme case that we've seen with one song getting a lot of jury love, and it's perfectly justifiable. Anyone could have come to that conclusion with a bit of due diligence. You just have to look at the numbers and put them into context. Now, with all that said, I do think that the circumstances of this year were a bit exceptional, and for that reason, I don't think that we should expect this to be a regular thing where we're going to see these drastic splits happening over and over again. But it is still an opportunity to talk about the voting system and question whether or not it needs changes, because these kinds of results are definitely not ideal. They give the impression that an already established artist is being protected by the industry. So let's talk about some possible changes and think about what effects they could have on the outcomes of future shows. One of the most common fixes that gets talked about is reducing the power of the juries so that the televote has more say in the final outcome. Now, we refer to the current system as 50-50. With the introduction of the rest of the world vote, it's now 50.6 to 49.4. It just very slightly benefits the public. But what some people want to see is for the weight to shift to something like 75% for the televote and 25% for the jury. This is the ratio that's been used for the last 3 editions of UMK in Finland. They do it by taking the total jury points, multiplying it by 3, and applying the percentage of televotes to that number. The irony is that since this voting system was introduced, the juries have agreed with the televote as far as who should be the winner on every occasion. The difference is that for other songs that have done better with the jury than with the televote, they suffer a lot more, like Alexandra this year, who went from second to second last. Now, before the ratio was changed, it was a classic 50-50 split. And if we look at the last show that happened under that format, we see a very typical Eurovision story. In 2020, the jury's first choice to represent Finland was Looking Back by Axel Kankanranta. I did my best. The televote's first choice was Cicciolina by Erika Vikman. Without even explaining the songs further, you can see exactly what I mean, right? The juries went for something sentimental and serious, the televote went for something lighthearted and fun. Name a more iconic duo. Much like this year's Eurovision Grand Final, it came down to who was going to do better with the other system. Erika came third with the juries, and Axel came second with the public, making him the overall winner. Afterwards, there was the expected outrage because the fans didn't get what they wanted, and in the end, everybody lost to COVID anyway. Now that was under a 50-50 system. If it were 75 televote to 25 jury, we would see a different result. Right? Well, let's see. Total jury votes multiplied by 3, apply the percentage to get the new televote score, add it to the jury score, and Axel still wins, just with a smaller lead. Yeah, it turns out there was only a 1.5% difference between the televote scores for Axel and Erika, but that didn't stop people from calling it a robbery. And you have to think about what the reaction would be like if this kind of thing were to happen at Eurovision, where even after shifting the needle in favor of the public, the jury favorite would still win. Now with Eurovision 2023, there was a big lead on both sides, so this kind of scenario wouldn't really apply. The public would have only needed 59% of the weight in order for Finland to be named the winner. But we know that now, after the fact. We wouldn't have known that before the votes came in. And if we're going to be looking at previous shows as guidelines for how to go forward, you might still find results that you don't agree with. A good example would be 2019. The public's first choice in that show was Norway, who got 291 points from the televote. The juries were much less impressed. They only gave them 40 points, which had them 18th in their ranking and then 6th overall. With such a big difference on both sides of the votes, 75 to 25 wouldn't have cut it. It would have had to been a whopping 87% in favor of the televote in order for Norway to have won. When the balance of power is so skewed, you can't really justify having juries anyway because their impact is so insignificant. And what would it be worth to a country like Czechia, who would go from 8th after the jury votes come in to 23rd? Well, this is where we get to the kind of show that some people want to see. No juries, all televote, the public decides everyone's fate. And what could go wrong? That's what the 2000s were. Yeah, it turns out a lot could go wrong. Eurovision's image was already in decline for many years, and this was like a nosedive off a cliff. The switch to 100% televote clearly made the contest much more about spectacle than music. It isn't to say that there weren't well-written songs from that era with strong performances, but I think that most people would agree that there's a definite quality problem when you look at the overall selection.
En la cárcel, no bailan en la escuela, no baila mi madre también.
While there are passionate fans who think of this as Eurovision's peak, there are just as many who don't, and I would have to imagine that the majority of people who work in music and television would side much more with the second group than with the first group. You need those people in order for Eurovision to have the presence that it has now. You need people to look at it as an opportunity for them, and it should be an opportunity for as many people as possible, not just for the artists that make bangers, girl bops, ethno bops, the kind of songs that we know the televote is going to eat up. The best thing about 50-50 is that the weaknesses on both sides are evened out. It's not going to produce your most ideal result or mine or any individual person's, but it always feels much more fair as a combined ranking than individually on either side. For that reason, I don't think the ratio is the problem and I think it should stay as it is, but there are other things that we could look at, especially on the jury side. Given that the issue seems to be that too few people have too much power, another popular recommendation is to increase the number of jurors on each individual jury. And that would make it so that their individual impact is reduced and you get a larger set of opinions overall. In addition, there's also been some criticism about who gets selected to be on the jury and whether or not they represent the diversity of songs that we actually see on stage. And because of that, it's speculated that radio-friendly songs have an advantage over other styles of music that aren't as radio-friendly. Therefore, they don't get as much praise despite having strong technique, originality, and all the other things that the jury criteria is asking for. Now, because this is such a popular opinion among the fans, and we don't really hear how the delegations feel about this, I think there are a few important things to consider. Firstly, How feasible is it really? And that might seem like a silly question because it's like, how hard is it to find 10 or 20 people who work in the music industry? But the thing is, you have to consider how each change to the system would affect every country. On the Eurovision website, you can find the criteria that jurors have to meet in order to be selected. They must have a musical or artistic background and relevant professional experience with a proven track record. They also can't be connected to any of the participants in a way that affects their ability to vote independently. The whole national jury is supposed to have a diversity of ages and genders, as one would hope. And once they've served as a juror, they can't take the seat again for 3 years. Now, this mostly seems to be followed, but people who have looked into the ages and backgrounds of the jury members have found certain reasons to be skeptical. For example, these are the ages of the Romanian jury in 2015, where there wasn't a single juror under 40, and the average age came out to 52.6. All of those people are older than the majority of participants, as well as a large portion of the viewing public. And when you look at how they voted, there is some appreciation for more contemporary styles like Latvia and Belgium, but with the top 3, Italy, Norway, and Russia, the styles of songs are clearly more appealing to an older demographic. Other times, the backgrounds of the jurors seem to be a bit questionable, or at least like they have a very vague connection to the arts and they don't necessarily outline an extensive professional experience. And some of the titles that I found were Cultural and Communication Manager, Cultural Promoter, Expert in the Field of Culture and Art, Deputy Head of the Professional Arts Department of the Ministry of Culture. These are the kind of jobs where people are appointed by like a government or a board of an organization, and you don't always need to have a background in the arts to get them. Now, with that said, this might not be the whole story. There might have been more information that was provided to the EBU to justify their appearance on the jury. It's just hard to see that from the outside. Background and diversity are important factors, of course, but it shouldn't just be about finding any group of professionals that meet that criteria. It should be about finding the right people who understand the level of production that Eurovision is. You could end up with a large jury that's made up of people who have tons of experience, but they're overall quite jaded and cynical towards the entertainment industry. That wouldn't make for a better result. That would just give people the opportunity to take out their frustrations on others because of how they've been treated professionally. It's also worth mentioning that not every public broadcaster has a great relationship with their country's arts community. There are bound to be many great choices in any country of people who would make fair and reasonable rankings if they were on a jury, but they might not want to be associated with their country's broadcaster for political reasons, ethical reasons, or just a general lack of faith. We only need to look as far back as last year, where there were 6 juries that were colluding with each other in order to benefit their chances at qualification. And I think it's a bit naive to think that the broadcasters had no knowledge that that was happening. We also know that some broadcasters struggle to get talent because of the image that Eurovision has in the country. Like, there's really several reasons for why some people are just reluctant to get involved in any way. So all this raises a few questions. Are the criteria being properly enforced, or has the EBU had to allow for some leeway because some broadcasters are already struggling to get 5 people every year? These are the kinds of things that I'm really curious about, and as such, I've reached out to some broadcasters to see if they can shed some light on this. Let's see if any of them get back to me, because I think that this would be something that all of us would find very interesting. Now, if let's say that it's not a problem and the EBU decides to go ahead with it, one thing to consider too is that a larger jury doesn't necessarily mean different results. With respect to this year, it's quite clear that when some people talk about wanting a larger and more diverse jury, what they're really saying is they want to envision a result where not nearly as many jurors ranked Sweden so high over other songs. And sure, like, that could have happened, but it also might not have happened. It could have just been twice as many of the same results, where Sweden is still mostly landing in people's top 10 and gets jury points across the board. If this were the setup that we had for 2017, I'm quite confident that this would have been the case for Portugal. I don't think that having more rock experts, EDM producers, and hip-hop artists would have made it so that we have a different winner. It could have given more points to some of those other songs that live outside the pop music kind of sphere, and I think that would have been the best possible outcome. But these are all hypothetical situations anyway. I just bring them up because if we see something like this in the future where one song is raking in all the points and getting a lot of high jury rankings, we shouldn't be that surprised, and we definitely shouldn't be jumping to conclusions about the show being fixed. If this is a feasible solution, then it would be definitely worthwhile for the EBU to explore. It's really hard to get a diverse set of opinions from 5 people, and as a matter of principle, it seems like the right thing to do. Now, people tend to be most focused on the weight and composition of the jury when they're thinking about how Eurovision can be in the future. But really, there are plenty of factors that affect the outcome, and I think that after this year, it is an opportunity to think about as many of them as possible to consider whether or not the system is producing a fair result. So to wrap things up, here's a brief rundown of some other factors that I think would be worth considering for the future of the show. Firstly, let's talk about the amount of points that are given out. The current point values with 12, 10, 8, 7, 6, and so on were introduced in 1975 when there were 19 participating countries. At the time, more than half of the songs would receive points from an individual country's scoring. Nowadays, we have as many as 26 in the grand final, which means that 16 songs won't get any points even if people are voting for them. Perhaps it's time that the songs that land in the 11th to 15th range also get points to better reflect the fact that they are being supported. Now, if this were to be considered, I don't think this would change the 12 points at the top because that has been such a big part of Eurovision's branding for almost 50 years, and it seems like for some people too scary of a change. But maybe a better way of approaching it would be for the point values to be something like 12, 10, 9, yes 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 3, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1. That way, it makes it so that those songs that land in the middle are still rewarded, but not as much as the ones that are closer to the top. Next, let's talk about running order. Since 2013, the order of performances has been handpicked by the production, and the TV industry person inside of me fully understands why. It really does improve the viewing experience. But the problem is that they're influencing the televote heavily, and I think that there's no more perfect example than the fact that Finland was given the best possible spot in the first half. It's fair to say that they probably would have won the televote no matter where they performed in the show, but the fact that they got a premium spot should also be considered in just how successful their score was. The producers set Finland up for success. And where does that fit into the conspiracy? Had they been drawn very early in the show, maybe the difference in televote score between Finland and Sweden wouldn't have been quite as big. Similarly, if Sweden had been drawn early and Finland even later, maybe that would have been enough to draw televote points away from Sweden and towards other songs, resulting in a Finnish win. It's also quite clear that the songs that perform early are at a massive disadvantage. And you have to wonder what kind of message the production is sending to those artists. It's like, well, you obviously won't win, so why do you even need points? I will say, though, that the real issue is just that there are far too many songs in the grand final, and I don't think that the running order placement would matter as much if the show was just shorter. But we know that cutting down the number of songs in the grand final is also not an option because of viewership. We know for a fact that the domestic audience won't tune in quite as much if their song doesn't make it into the grand final, so that's just something that we're gonna have to live with. Rather than going back to a completely random running order, what could be a good compromise is a hybrid solution. It could be that the producers still come up with an order, but one country is drawn into the first spot or the last spot or a random spot, and then that pre-created order just follows it to decide where everyone else performs. That way, the program still has the flow that the producers are hoping for, but those premium spots aren't just hand-picked. The favorites are probably not going to suffer that much anyway, given how much attention there is in the lead up to the show, but at least all of the other songs will be given a fair chance, rather than being deliberately placed early in the show and limiting their chance at success. Finally, the fact that the public and jury vote in such different ways is, I think, something that should be rethought because it clearly impacts the spread of points. The way that I see the fandom evolving is that certain people are clearly way too invested in the artists and their success. So if given the opportunity to spam the votes as much as possible, they'll take that opportunity. I voted 20 times in each show, but for 3, 4, 5 different songs. And I was very happy to do that because I wanted to support the songs and artists that I liked. My brother voted 20 times, but for the same song. And mathematically speaking, that's a more strategic way to get the winner that you want because it will get that song even further in the ranking, which ultimately determines how many points it gets. In an ideal world, voting would only be done through an app, and it could be managed in a way that if you want to vote multiple times for one song, you have to put some votes towards others, kind of like how they do it with Junior Eurovision. But the fact that we still have voting over the phone and text message is probably something that needs to stay for accessibility reasons, so I don't think that it would ever be exclusively us voting through an app. What could be done is placing a cap on votes for the same song, something like 5, and hopefully that would encourage people to use those other votes towards others. But I could also see people saying that it would disincentivize voting and result in less money, so maybe that wouldn't be a solution either. But with all that said, anything that could be done to get the two sides of the system to vote more similarly, I think would be for the benefit of the show and could perhaps reduce these big gaps that we see on either side. Anyway, these are just some areas of consideration. There are certainly others that we could talk about, but we've covered a lot of ground. Do you agree with any of the proposed changes to the voting system? Are there other areas that you think could benefit from some changes? Let me know what you have to say. Also, in the process of making this video, I did another one where I tried to rank this year's grand final songs in a similar way to how the jurors are required to. You can find that here or in the link below. And if you haven't done so already, I would love if you subscribe to the channel. There's lots more to come, and I'd love to have you back so that we can talk about Sweden 2024. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.